Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, sports fans, leftists, progressives, and social radicals. This is another edition of Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports, leftist sports radio, a weekly news hour highlighting the various intersections of sports, politics, and radical activism. We're available for broadcast by Pacific Radio member network stations, college and community radio stations, and low-power FM stations, as many already are. If you can't listen live, we're available via audio podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, and through the Google Play Store. Audio streams of our podcast and video editions are also available at our site, notanothersportshow.podbean.com. To contact the show, you can use the hashtag @NASRadioSports on Twitter and Instagram, at Not Another Sports Show on Facebook, or the hashtag NASRadio. Quick update from our last show. Obviously, we were on the disabled list last week, and so this is the mid-February Super Show, talking the last 2 weeks of news from the week of February 11th and the week of February 18th. And an update from our last show, after the U.S. federal judge blocked Donald Trump's Islamophobic immigration ban because of its unconstitutionality on its face, Iran has lifted their own responsive ban to allow the U.S. wrestling team into the country for the Freestyle World Cup wrestling tournament. So that is very awesome to see. And we also want to send a quick shout out of props to the St. John's 5th grade CYO team. And normally we don't talk about youth sports very often on this show, but the St. John's 5th grade CYO team has been playing as a team since the 3rd grade, and the CYO demanded that they kick 2 girls off of their team or face a forfeit for the rest of the season. And when the 5th graders were asked, do you want to kick your 2 female teammates off the team, or do you just want to forfeit the rest of the season, they unanimously picked to forfeit the rest of the season rather than kick their 2 female teammates off the team. So the kids are all right. Very nice job there, kids, pushing back against that kind of ridiculous bigotry. Let kids play sports. Just let them play. Let them play sports. We've got an absolutely stacked show, as we were on the disabled list last week, and so we've got to talk the Super Bowl, the issues of the Super Bowl going into Texas, the potential NBA All-Star Game going into Texas, and a lot of stadium shenanigans happening around the sports world, and even a little bit of Olympic news as the next host cities for the Olympics are being finalized, and what's happening in cities that have already been chosen. So we've got a whole lot to talk about this week on the show, and we're going to get right into it with NFL news. In NFL news this week, there were protests outside of Super Bowl 51 with Standing Rock supporters. The No Dakota Access Pipeline activists were out protesting out in front of the Super Bowl. Anti-Trump activists were protesting outside of the Super Bowl, using some of the mass media attention that was going to the Super Bowl to highlight their various causes. And it was a Super Bowl that saw the Patriots come back from a completely improbable situation to win. And as we talked about the show right before the Super Bowl, it was very difficult for us to choose. Certainly politically, we wanted to see the Patriots potentially lose, but then there was also the issues politically that we could see players on the team refuse to go to the White House and use this as a political stand. We also talked about the awkwardness and the hilariousness that would be Roger Goodell, the commissioner of the National Football League, handing the Lombardi Trophy over to Tom Brady, given their very acrimonious relationship that they have with one another. And ultimately, the Atlanta Falcons choked away the giant lead that they had, a lead that was 2.5 times larger than the largest lead that was ever blown during a Super Bowl, for the Patriots to come from behind and win the Super Bowl. And in the aftermath of them winning, Martellus Bennett one of their players, had already said that he was going to skip the White House visit. He did say again that he is going to skip the White House visit because he doesn't agree with Donald Trump's policies and Donald Trump's politics and doesn't agree, as he put it, with the man in the House. Defensive player Devin McCourty said, quote, "I don't feel accepted in the White House," close quote, and also publicly announced that he will be skipping the White House visit. Bennett and McCourty were the two players that raised their fists during the regular season protests when many players were raising fists or taking knees during the national anthem. Martellus Bennett and Devin McCourty were those two players for the New England Patriots, and they're also two of the players that are skipping the White House visit. LeGarrette Blount, the running back, said, quote, "I will not be going to the White House. I don't feel welcome in that house. I'll leave it at that," close quote. We also had the white player that supported Colin Kaepernick's protest, Chris Long, stating that he is not going and he didn't plan on going and didn't necessarily publicize it until people started asking him about it. Dante Hightower and Alan Branch also said that they will not be appearing, but didn't give any kind of overt political rationale to it publicly. And Chris Long in this list is one of the interesting ones because we haven't seen many white players in the NFL. We haven't seen many white players in general being ones that are also putting themselves out there in this and getting involved in this and being allies to their teammates and being allies to the public. And Chris Long talked on his Twitter account this week about some of the comments that he's received from people about his not going to the White House. And he had said a number of different quotes that he had received, and then he fires back at them. So the first quote that he received was, quote, "Respect the office," to which he responded, quote, "Okay, birther theory guy," close quote. He was also told, quote, "Stick to football." He responded, quote, "You don't look like a state senator yourself there, bud," close quote. To people who said, quote, "I hope they cut you," he responded, quote, "I'm a free agent." Quote, "Stop being so self-important. I'm no longer a fan." Quote, "I'm self-important, but you thought this was important enough to bring to my attention, huh?" Quote, "You just want to be a cool lib." Quote, "Actually, I'm well aware the minute that I believe something that they don't, libs will hit me with this gif." And it was a gif of a woman saying, "I was rooting for you. We were all rooting for you." He also pushed back against that same idea that you just want to be a cool lib, saying, quote, "As a football player, liberals thought I was a living, breathing piece of steak before I agreed with them," close quote. And very often that is true, and it's one of these spaces that we're trying to show here with this show, is that progressives, liberals, leftists, people on the far left, anarchists, socialists who have written off sports as some kind of reactionary neo-right-wing idea or the Noam Chomsky idea that it doesn't really matter, are the ones who are incorrect, and that we can find a whole lot of overlap and a whole lot of discussion of the political realm here. And while that may be true that a lot of people thought that Chris Long was the living, breathing piece of steak before he agreed with us, we do realize that athletes are using their platforms to speak out. They have that ability to use their platforms to speak out, and we are very much happy when athletes do use their platforms to speak out about the world in which they live. He was also told, quote, "You hate the troops." Long's response, quote, "The secondary focus of my foundation, out of two causes, is veteran support. Do your research. Also, not relatable." Quote, "You hate white people. You realize all humans that live in America should be concerned? Also, that assumption says something about you." Quote, "Stop believing the media. Dude, I just saw you retweet Fox News. You should go talk to Trump if you want change. I'm skipping a photo op, not a congressional hearing," close quote. And it's really powerful to see athletes using their platforms, athletes using this availability to start speaking out about the politics of the world in which they live, using the platform that they have, that they're not going to give the legitimacy, that they're not going to give the normalcy that would come to this administration with a lot of its policies that it is engaged in. And that's not necessarily being hypocritical of, you weren't critical of the Obama administration. You can go back and look in the record. We were incredibly critical of that. And wrong is wrong, no matter who does it or who says it, no matter which of the capitalist parties is in power. Meanwhile, the aforementioned Colin Kaepernick has announced his January donations. That he announced during the regular season he was going to be donating $1 million over the next 10 months. And so January's donations went to the Coalition for Human Immigrant Rights of Los Angeles, the Center for Reproductive Rights, 350.org, the climate change organization, and Black Veterans for Social Justice. Of course, more donations will be coming from Kaepernick, and he is making this very clear of who he is donating to and why he is donating to them in their causes of fighting oppression and fighting for equal justice for everyone in America. The other big news coming out of the NFL this week has been with the PR campaign to Israel. A number of players were contacted about doing a PR trip to the nation of Israel. And 11 players were initially put on the list to show up to Israel and do a brief PR stop to try to show, hey, we can get big stars from America in here too. And very rightly and very widely, this was seen and panned as a move to normalize the occupation and normalize the brutality of which Palestinian people live under every single day. And so an open letter was written to these players by a number of different prominent political activists, saying, quote, "We are writing to you as individuals and groups who work in support of human rights and collective liberation and admire many of you who have been outspoken in movements for freedom and justice in the United States. We've been especially inspired by you using your celebrity to shed light about and support various struggles, including Black Lives Matter. The decision by Martellus Bennett to boycott the upcoming Patriots team visit to the White House following the Super Bowl win is especially brave and sends a clear message that one must take a stand against racism and oppression. Based on the public dedication to social justice that many of you share, it came as a surprise to us that we'll see you go on a tour of Israel next week, sponsored by the Israeli government, as part of an effort to get you to become, quote, ambassadors for goodwill for Israel. We would ask that you reconsider attending. These trips bringing celebrities to Israel are part of the larger Brand Israel campaign to help the Israeli government normalize and whitewash its ongoing denial of Palestinian rights. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs has dedicated a lot of resources to this campaign, which is designed explicitly to improve Israel's image abroad to counter worldwide outrage over its massacres and war crimes. Speaking about your trip, Israel's head of strategic affairs and public diplomacy, Minister Gilad Erdan, said, quote, "The ministry which I lead is spearheading an intensive fight against the delegitimization and boycott, divestments, and sanctions campaign against Israel, and part of this struggle includes hosting influencers and opinion formers of international standing in different fields, including sport." Close quote. In other words, they're aiming to use your fame to advance their own agenda, an agenda that comes at the expense of Palestinian people. Palestinians have chosen boycott as a tactic only after exhausting so many other approaches, and with the guidance of black South Africans who called for BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, against the apartheid regime until it ended. As you are probably aware, the cultural boycott, including sports, was of particular significance in challenging apartheid in South Africa. What Palestinians face due to Israeli policies is familiar to black and brown communities in the United States, and vice versa. That's why when activists in Ferguson were facing tear gas by police while organizing to demand justice from Mike Brown in the summer of 2014, Palestinian activists were treating them advice on how to deal with its effects, and people in Ferguson were holding up signs in solidarity with Palestinians under Israeli bombs in Gaza. That's why in 2015, more than 1,100 black activists, artists, scholars, students, and organizations, including Angela Davis, Cornel West, and Talib Kweli, signed a Black Solidarity Statement with Palestine, declaring that their commitment to working to ensure the Palestinian liberation at the same time as we work towards our own. This is why more than 60 leading black and Palestinian artists and activists, including Lauryn Hill, Alice Walker, and Danny Glover, were featured in a video highlighting challenges that both communities are confronting, including militarized policing and the prison industry. That is why rallies across the United States today, people are chanting from Palestine to Mexico, all these walls have got to go. Palestinians have been fighting for decades against policies similar to the ones that people are protesting in the United States. This May, Palestinians will mark 69 years since they were forcibly displaced off their lands during the establishment of the State of Israel. Since then, Israel has continued to expel, deny, and ban Palestinians, tearing apart families and keeping millions of refugees from returning home. Their brutal military occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem has now lasted 50 years and has included the building of illegal Jewish-only settlements on stolen Palestinian land, the construction of an apartheid wall to further keep Palestinians out, and the destruction of more than 25,000 Palestinian homes. Within Israel, there's a purposeful policy to divide people based on their nationality and religion, with more than 50 laws that privilege Jewish citizens over non-Jewish citizens. Palestinian athletes have been subject to the violence by Israeli soldiers and have not been allowed to travel to participate in competition, including the Rio Olympics. And this summer will mark 3 years since Israel's deadly assault on Gaza, when Israel dropped an estimated 20,000 tons of explosive, killing at least 2,200 Palestinians, including 500 children. All of these war crimes against Palestinians are being funded by the United States, which sends at least $3.8 billion in military aid to Israel every year. They continued talking about a number of the issues in it and then closed saying, quote, "You now have an opportunity to speak out against the injustices facing Palestinians. We urge you to rethink your participation in this trip to Israel and the message it will send to millions of your fans who look up to you. The power athletes have in contributing to the fight for justice is evidenced in the legacy of the late Muhammad Ali, who himself was an advocate for Palestinian rights. Angela Davis recently said at the Women's March in Washington, D.C., attended by tens of thousands of people, women's rights are human rights all over the planet, and that is why we have to say freedom and justice for Palestine. Please reconsider taking this trip to ensure you're standing on the right side of history," close quote. And the response from the players came very, very quickly, with a number of players retweeting statements from Michael Bennett, who wrote a very powerful statement. Justin Forsett of the Broncos said that he won't be going. Kenny Stills retweeted the statement and said, quote, "Couldn't have said it any better, I'm in." Martellus Bennett retweeted his brother's statement. And Michael Bennett's statement on this is one of the more powerful athlete statements in recent history, saying, quote, "I was scheduled to make a visit to Israel with fellow NFL players. I was excited to see this remarkable and historic part of the world with my own eyes. I was not aware, until reading this article about the trip in the Times of Israel, that my itinerary was being constructed by the Israeli government for the purposes of making me, in the words of a government official, a, quote, influencer and opinion maker who would then be a, quote, ambassador of goodwill. I will not be used in such a manner. When I do go to Israel, and I do plan to go, it will be not only to see Israel, but also the West Bank and Gaza, so I can see how the Palestinians who have called this land home for thousands of years live their lives. One of my heroes has always been Muhammad Ali. I know that Ali always stood strongly with the Palestinian people, visiting refugee camps, going to rallies, and always willing to be a voice for the voiceless. I want to be a voice for the voiceless, and I cannot do that by going on this kind of trip to Israel. I know that this will anger some people and inspire others, but please know I did not do this for you, but to be in accord with my own values and my own conscience. Like 1968 Olympian John Carlos always says, there is no partial commitment to justice. You either want in or you want out. Well, I'm in," close quote. And this has been a really powerful statement that over half of the delegation decided not to go. Michael Kendricks, Delaney Walker, Cameron Jordan, Dan Williams, and Calais Campbell did end up going, but the PR capability, the pushback against it, was one that really significantly pushed back. We also have talk of future Super Bowls, as the NFL came out and did something that is actually good. And it's not oftentimes we can actually say that on this show, that the NFL did something that was good, that Roger Goodell did something right. It's a sentence that's really weird to say. It's a sentence that doesn't happen very often, but it's one we have to utter at this moment, because Senate Bill 6 in the state of Texas is a proposed anti-trans bathroom law, which is seeking to punish trans people for using the bathroom of their identified gender. And NFL spokesperson Brian McCarthy spoke out about the law, saying, quote, "If a proposal that is discriminatory or inconsistent with our values were to become law in Texas, that would certainly be a factor considered when thinking about awarding future events. The NFL embraces inclusiveness. We want all fans to feel welcomed at our events, and NFL policies prohibit discrimination based on age, gender, race, religion, sexual orientation, or any other improper standard, close quote. This is the same league that in the 1990s moved the Super Bowl out of Arizona over its refusal to acknowledge Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday as a federal holiday. The NBA moved the All-Star game out of North Carolina over a very similar anti-trans bathroom law. The NCAA has moved playoff and championship events out of North Carolina over a very similar law. Yet the state of Texas is very much set on wanting to push this kind of law for their state. Governor Greg Abbott pushed back by saying, quote, NFL decision makers also benched Tom Brady last season. It ended with the NFL handing the Super Bowl trophy to Brady, close quote. Well, here's the thing. You're not Tom Brady. And the NFL decision makers did bench Tom Brady. You're certainly right about that, and it wasn't the greatest decision. And yeah, it may have ended with the Super Bowl trophy handing it to Brady, but you're not Tom Brady, and an anti-trans law, a bigoted law that seeks to try to police bathrooms, is not the Super Bowl, and you're not Tom Brady. It's a really ham-fisted analogy. Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick said that teams will be able to set their own policies at the stadiums and will not be subject to the bathroom bill. Because, see, it's not discrimination because these teams can come in and say, hey, we're not going to have the discriminatory policy. But for private citizens, well, then it's going to be really ridiculously bigoted and we're going to have this discriminatory policy. Saying that big moneymakers won't have to be subject to your bigoted policy doesn't show that your policy is actually right. It shows that your policy is indefensible and you're trying to avoid economic boycotts and economic repercussions for it. Well, Governor Abbott went on Glenn Beck's radio show this week and said that the NFL was, quote, walking on thin ice, close quote, and that the league, quote, needs to concentrate on playing football and get the heck out of politics, close quote. He also noted, quote, allowing NFL football players to kneel during the national anthem. These are people, especially with the quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers, taking a knee when the national anthem is being played. He's getting paid $100 million to play a game, complaining that he is oppressed. He needs to be standing up in respect for the men and women who died fighting in the United States military, so he had the freedom to go out and play a game and get paid $100 million. I gotta tell you, I cannot name or even count the number of Texans who told me that they were not watching the NFL. They were protesting the NFL this year because of the gross political statement allowed by the NFL by allowing these players who are not oppressed, who are now almost like snowflake little politicians themselves, who are unable to take the United States national anthem even being played, close quote. And in seeing this statement, this bizarre, hypocritical, mindless statement from the governor, I was thinking a few different things. Number one, what Jerry Jones had to be doing in his office. Jerry Jones, the owner of the Dallas Cowboys. Jerry Jones had to be sitting in his office yelling at someone to get him a phone so he could call Governor Abbott to tell him to close the hole in his head that makes words so they can go out here and make this money. Because if Governor Abbott and Dan Patrick, the lieutenant governor, are going to go out and cut off millions of dollars coming into this state so they can get their bigoted bona fides, Jerry Jones is probably going to weigh in on that and tell them to sit down and close the hole in their head that makes words so they can come and keep making money. I was really interested in seeing what Jerry Jones was going to say about this, or what Jerry Jones was thinking about this. Also, walking on thin ice? What power do you have to threaten the NFL? Like, how are you going to say the NFL is going to possibly get any kind of pushback from you? When you use the term you're walking on thin ice, when you have power over a person or power over an entity to do something, saying that they're walking on thin ice. Is this more of just that dumb don't mess with Texas bravado that I don't get and don't like? I really feel this is just more of that bravado. And I can't tell if it's unintentional irony or blatant hypocrisy in his statement, because the league is inherently political. Hell, during the interview, he talks about the national anthem. Playing the national anthem is inherently political. Playing the national anthem is an inherently political thing. That is political. So if you want them to get out of politics, then perhaps they don't play the national anthem. But if they do that, I'm sure Governor Abbott would be on television and on radio yelling about the NFL not wanting to be proud of America. But he wants him to get out of politics. The thing is, he wants him to get out of politics he doesn't like. And if you're going to say get out of politics, then go after the teams who had the paid patriotism scandal, that were taking money from the U.S. Defense Department, taking money from the Pentagon, and putting on covert advertisements, essentially, without telling the general public that they were advertisements for the military. Go after that if you want to talk about sports not being political. There's certainly ways to talk about sports not being political. But don't inject a political aspect to this. Say you're okay with those things, and then get mad when there's an issue of politics that you don't like. And then say that they need to get out of politics. And I really can't tell if this is unintentional irony or blatant hypocrisy when he talks about Colin Kaepernick and the others being quote-unquote snowflakes. Well, out here on the radio, yelling and whining about the league saying anything about their anti-trans bigoted bathroom law, to say that they're immediately boycotting because a person didn't stand up for the Pledge of Allegiance. A person doesn't have to stand up for the Pledge of Allegiance. In fact, forcing people to stand up for the Pledge of Allegiance is really pretty much antithetical to the freedoms that we all have. So he wants the celebrations of the freedoms we all have by mandating that people have to do certain things that he wants. And the irony or the hypocrisy here of calling these people snowflakes is inherent with the reactionary forces of the alt-right, the neo-Nazi movement. That they talk about triggered liberals and needing safe spaces, but then you have things like, hey, we might not put a Super Bowl in your state. You need to be on thin ice with us. You need to blah, 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 blah. And they start losing their, they start losing it, yelling and screaming and whining on a radio show. Or Netflix issues the show Dear White People, and they lose it, start demanding that people delete their Netflix accounts, that this is going to be white genocide, and this is putting out the thing, because they apparently need a safe space. Or when people went to Hamilton, and Mike Pence got a comment from the members of the Playcast in Hamilton. Or when Star Wars was going to come out, and they got mad at that. It's the inherent irony or the inherent hypocrisy, I'm not quite sure which one it is, of this movement calling people on the left snowflakes and talk about them needing safe spaces and being triggered, while at the exact same time throwing out this righteous and very right-wing righteous Twitter tantrums, social media tantrums, and public tantrums about things that they don't like policy-wise. And yes, he is certainly right. Soldiers died for a lot of reasons. Soldiers died for a lot of things. One of those things they died for was the freedom to not have to stand for a compulsory pledge. If you like compulsory pledges of adoration for a nation or compulsory pledges for a leader, then might I interest you in a totalitarian state? Might I interest you in that instead, because that seems more to your liking. And of course, there is the very obvious joke in here about Governor Abbott saying he can't name or even count the number of Texans who said they wouldn't watch the NFL. There's the real obvious ignorance joke in there, ha ha, funny, but it's really low-hanging fruit, and so I kind of avoided it. But this bathroom bill needs to go, and the pushback against it is not just coming from the NFL, as we'll be talking about in a few minutes. You're listening to Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports, left sports media. We've just been discussing the aftermath of Super Bowl 51, athletes not being props for the Israeli unjust occupation, and the ridiculous pushback by Texas's governor to justify anti-trans bigotry. Coming up on Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports, left sports media, we'll be analyzing the NBA joining in on the crackdown on Texas's proposal, the D-League getting some major changes, and the changes that need to happen, and North Carolina still facing sports consequences for its own ridiculous anti-trans bathroom bill being on the books. And so we're going to jump straight into basketball news. In basketball news this week, the NBA has also issued a statement to the state of Texas over their anti-trans bathroom bill, saying that any environment where people are not being treated, quote, fairly and equally, close quote, is an issue for the NBA. Texas has hosted 3 All-Star games since 2006 and are in very real risk of potentially not hosting another one because the NBA has moved an All-Star game over an anti-trans bathroom law. We saw that happen in North Carolina, and the NBA very much might be doing it again, that they've established the precedent that they will be doing it. So it's not just the NFL that's getting involved. The NBA has also come in and pushed back against the anti-trans bigoted bathroom bills. Speaking of athletes getting involved and speaking back against bigoted policies, LeBron James talked about the immigration ban and said, quote, "I am not in favor of this policy or any policy that divides and excludes people. I stand with the many, many Americans who believe this does not represent what the United States is all about, and we should continue to speak out about it. Diversity is what makes this country so great. We should all continue to speak up and fight for ideas that bring people together regardless of race, gender, ethnicity, religious belief, or any other differences." We even had Under Armour putting out a statement saying that business-wise, President Donald Trump is a, quote, asset, close quote, to which Stephen Curry, a member of the Golden State Warriors, star player for the Golden State Warriors, and also a star athlete who has a sponsorship deal with Under Armour, to joke, that statement is true if, quote, you remove the ET from asset, close quote. And almost immediately after Steph Curry made that comment, which, number one, kind of shocked me. I was in that kind of weird state of Steph Curry said that. Steph Curry making that kind of statement, that there was immediately a bunch of discussions with Under Armour of how he could still work with Under Armour if they were aligning themselves this way or not, and Under Armour having to distance themselves and walk themselves back and walk themselves back and walk themselves back to try to get Steph Curry back on board and Steph Curry to be okay with what was said and walking back that statement and pulling back that statement. And you also saw a huge hit to the stock price of Under Armour, that the brand took a massive hit for coming out politically in discussing these matters. The NBA and the D-League, the Development League, have announced a corporate deal with Gatorade coming for an upcoming season. They will have the Gatorade logo on all balls. They will have the Gatorade logo on all jerseys, all court signs, and the league tentatively is being renamed the G League for Gatorade. But in all of these changes of the logo on the ball, the logo on the jerseys, the logo on the court, the league being renamed for corporate branding, nowhere in this did they announce the one change that needs to be made. Nowhere did they announce the one change that should be happening. That one change that should be happening is raises for the players. The players can either currently get $19,500 salaries or $26,000 salaries per year, but only 5 of the 12 players can get the $26,000 salary, and there is a team cap of $209,000 per team. Before this current season, players just made $13,000. $13,000 is right above the federal poverty line, that these players are making poverty wages. These players are making poverty wages while the NBA is bringing in record billions. The NBA is making record billions off of its television deals, making record billions off of people coming into the stadiums, making record billions off of merchandising sales. And yet they can't see fit to pay the D-League players anymore. That they've got this new corporate deal with Gatorade for the G League, with the logos happening to be plastered all over the stuff, and the players, the people who create the value for the D-League, are not going to be the ones seeing much of any of the benefits. The one change that needed to happen is the change that is not currently happening, and that's the D-League players needing to get paid better. And that's happening across the country and across the world, in not only the sports world, but in jobs in general, of people being paid the absolute minimum, and instead of pushing with solidarity for activists and workers who are demanding wage justice and to be paid better. We have people engaged in a race to the bottom ideology. This ideology of, well, I don't have a pension, so no one should. Well, I don't get overtime pay, so no one should. Well, I don't get this, so no one should. That we're running this race to the bottom ideology. A race to the bottom is not what we should be aiming for. It should be a race to the top in making all of workers' lives better and making sure that all workers have the fruits of their labor. Because without the players on the court, the D League, or soon to be the G League, is just a really good idea. Without the players, nothing happens. Without the workers, nothing occurs. Without labor, all they've got is an idea. It takes workers to actually make it happen. In unpaid college sports news, North Carolina is still being subject to the NCAA's smackdown over its anti-trans bathroom bill, House Bill 2. The state sports association sent a letter to the state government talking about why it would be a very good idea to get rid of the anti-trans bathroom bill, House Bill 2, saying that the NCAA is set to start to be voting on events for 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, and 2022. And North Carolina will not be in the running for hosting any of those events because anti-trans bathroom bill, House Bill 2, is still on the books. And so they could not only lose out on the current issues of hosting any kind of major events like the Final Four tournaments and some of the major NCAA basketball tournaments for March Madness, but they could lose out on them up to 2022 over this if they want to keep this bigoted bathroom law on the books. Republicans have said that they want a bill that will repeal House Bill 2, but the bill that they want to throw out there to repeal House Bill 2 also has a poison pill in it. That poison pill prevents any city from implementing non-discrimination policies for 6 months, and the 6-month policy can be renewed indefinitely, meaning that there will never be non-discrimination policies being put forward in cities with the renewable 6-month policy. And of course, the Democratic Party is refusing to do just that. Something fiscally responsible Republicans, something hypocrisy. This is really overt as an example of it, and North Carolina could face some massive repercussions financially up through 2022 if they want to keep this bigoted law on the books. You're listening to Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports, Left Sports Radio. And we've just been discussing sports resistance to the anti-trans state policies that are being put forward in Texas and in North Carolina, and why it's time to improve the payments for the D-League players. It's more than been a high time for that to happen. Coming up on Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports, Left Sports Radio, we will be analyzing stadium shenanigans and the latest in Olympic news. This has been our mid-February super show here on Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at sports, and we are going to round it up with our final segment of Other Sports News. In other sports news, the Major League Soccer Stadium in St. Louis is again back in the news. The judge has put the April 4th ballot question on the ballot. This is going to mean that on the April 4th ballot in St. Louis, the residents will actually have a say, and they have to vote yes on 2 questions to get this money to go to a MLS stadium. They would need to improve a sales tax, that they would need to say yes to a sales tax, and then yes to a question to use that money to fund a stadium. If they say no to either one of those questions, then it is defeated. And this has been a proposal that has been dead, then it's alive, then it was dead again, now it's alive. Now they've got the legal loopholes to throw this onto a ballot for the April 4th election. We will certainly be keeping our eye on this, as the governor is not a very big fan of publicly funded stadiums and using public funds when there's lots of other social services and other things that need to be funded with the money. That we'll be keeping an eye on this as well. Meanwhile, in Detroit, a Major League Soccer team is being proposed, and Dan Gilbert, the owner of the Cleveland Cavaliers, has a huge real estate presence in Detroit. That his shell companies and his subsidiary companies have this huge presence in downtown Detroit. And he has offered to build a soccer stadium for a Detroit MLS team, and has offered them, in exchange for $300 million, the rights to the previous site for the stadium, and a, quote, credit to be paid to the company for the savings a new consolidated criminal justice complex would provide, close quote. Now, why is he talking about a criminal justice complex, you ask? Because Dan Gilbert has told Wayne County, if you give me $300 million and you give me this plot of land, I will build you a new jail. The jail you stopped building in 2013 that went over budget. Originally, the budget for the jail was $220 million. It soon became $391 million. And I haven't heard a ton about anti-jail activists and anti-incarceration activists pushing back against this stadium policy. I haven't heard a lot from anti-stadium advocates pushing back against this policy proposal from Dan Gilbert, the owner of the Cleveland Cavaliers, to push a stadium and the public financing of a stadium in exchange for building a jail for the county. That this is so disturbing on so many different levels, from the financial irresponsibilities of using public funds to build a privately owned stadium and letting the billionaire owners get the funds for that stadium sent to them and then make all the profits off of it. There's certainly that aspect to this story of why it's just really terrible policy for the public to be financing private wealth development. But there's also then the issue of mass incarceration, that building more jails simply means more people are going to be filling those beds. Police will be out arresting people for even more charges, bringing more people in, increasing the state police structures, increasing these policing structures and the power of the state to arrest more individuals, to give them criminal records, and if they're felony cases, to pull their rights away from them for extended periods of time. That there could be a very interesting intersection here between the fiscal justice activists of the sports world and anti-incarceration activists to highlight the intersections between these causes, especially in a story like this one coming out of Detroit, Michigan. We also do want to send some quick props to the Danish Soccer Players Union for pushing a campaign to push back against homophobia with a reporting hotline for fans and players to call in if they hear homophobic statements at the stadium, as well as a visibility campaign to push back against homophobia. That the visibility campaigns are always a positive thing to see. The reporting hotline could be helpful. It's also going to be very, very helpful to see that there is some real pushback and real demands for there to be consequences for the actions. That real consequences is going to be the big issue here. Real consequences are going to be part of what changes this. It's not only going to be the educational components, that there has to be consequences for it, that there needs to be consequences for it. That's going to be a key aspect of this. We can certainly have all the reporting hotlines, we can certainly have all the information coming out about homophobic actions, homophobic activities, but it's going to be not only the educational component, the visibility component, but consequences that occur as a result. While the arguments for a MLS stadium for a MLS team that doesn't quite yet exist in St. Louis will be on the April 4th ballot, where they're being asked to approve potentially funding a stadium through public means for a team that doesn't quite just exist yet. The St. Louis Blues have asked for $67 million in stadium fixes, and the city council has approved $67 million going to the St. Louis Blues for stadium fixes. This is $67 million in current value, but over time, when you adjust for inflation, we'll be talking about $105 million over time, which has led Alderman Antonio French from St. Louis to say, quote, "We do not have $105 million to give to anybody, and we're about to give money to some of the richest people in town because they want a new scoreboard," close quote. That's exactly correct, and it's really at the heart of one of the political issues inherent to sports. That public funding of stadiums is an inherently political issue in sports. And whenever money is being spent by a city government, by a state government, by a county government, it's opportunity cost. That money could be used to spend on something else. And $105 million that's going to be spent to give a brand new scoreboard to billionaire owners who don't want to pay for it themselves is $105 million that could be going to schools. It's $105 million that could be going to social services. It's $105 million that could be spent in so many different and better ways than giving the St. Louis Blues a brand new scoreboard and to fix the stadium that they play in, when it's very much on their end, and they have the money, they have the financial capabilities to fund the stadium fixes and the stadium refurbishments they want for themselves. Meanwhile, in fencing news and also about the immigration ban, U.S. Olympic fencer Ibtihaj Muhammad said that she was detained by U.S. Customs for 2 hours without receiving any explanation, saying, quote, "I can't tell you why it happened to me, but I know that I'm Muslim. I have an Arabic name. And even though I represent Team USA and I have that Olympic hardware, it doesn't change how you look and how people perceive you," close quote. And you hear that, Governor Abbott? It doesn't change how you look, and it doesn't change how people perceive you. That players and athletes very often, very, very often, will be subject to police abuse. Very often they'll be subject to mistreatment because they are Muslim or because they are a person of color. And once the police figure out who they are, once police figure out, oh man, it's a celebrity, we screwed up, then it becomes really big fan, really big, oops. I remember talking about the story of Vic Power, the Cleveland first baseman in Major League Baseball in the 1950s, who is a black Latino. And friend of the show, Dr. Adrian Burgos, had written in his book about the case, and has been on the show in years past talking about it, where he would be driving his very fancy car in areas of Cleveland that people of color weren't normally in, and that he would routinely get pulled over by police. And the police would walk up and basically ask what a black man was doing driving that kind of fancy car in this part of Cleveland. And then once they figured out it was Vic Power, having to fold faster than Superman on laundry day and having to walk it all back of, oh, big fan, real big fan. Sorry, Mr. Power, you can go on your way. That's the issue here. Muhammad said, quote, "My human response is to cry because I was so sad and upset and disheartened and just disappointed. At the same time, I'm one of those people who feels like I have to be strong for those people who may not be able to find that strength. I feel like I have to speak up for those people whose voices go unheard. It was a really hard 2 hours, but at the same time, I made it home. I'll try to remember to be positive and to try to leave all these situations, even if they may be very difficult, with love. I think we'll come on top as women, as people of color, as Muslims, as trans people, as people who are part of the disabled community. I think that we'll come out on top," close quote. And that's largely due to the pushback. It's due to the movements demanding justice. It's due to people engaged in activism and pushing back and saying, not in our name, not this time, never again. It's not going to happen. And we will push back, and we will be there, and there will be repercussions for bad policy. There will not be this kind of thing happening in our name. And the pushback against this kind of policy. And it's heartening to see the people who are now very much mad about deportations. They're very much mad about immigration bans that were largely relatively silent when those things were happening during the previous 8 years of the Obama administration, or the drone campaign in the Obama administration, being relatively silent on those matters, that hopefully we can build the consistency, the ideological consistency, the push of ideological consistency on these issues, that we can continue to build and movement build and organize, that wrong is going to be wrong no matter which person says it, if the person has the appropriate letter after their name in their political party, or if they don't. Meanwhile, in Olympics news, the 2018 Olympics is set for Pyeongchang, South Korea. And friend of the show and past guest, Jules Boykoff, has written a new article for Jacobin Magazine about the Pyeongchang, South Korea Winter Olympics coming for 2018. Saying that costs were projected originally to be between $3.5 and $7.5 billion to host the Olympics, which $3.5 to $7.5 billion is already an amount of money that is completely egregious for the public funding of this private IOC enterprise. But now the costs have ballooned to almost double that at the high end, to $13 billion for the 2018 Winter Olympics. And that's right now about a year out from the Winter Olympics, that they're already at $13 billion. The projected cost only set to rise. That 4 members of the bid team were nailed for corruption. The president of South Korea has been in her own major corruption scandal, and there has been a lot of discussion and political upheaval there over the presidential corruption scandal and what has been happening there. The 4 members of the bid team being nailed for corruption, which may also be connected to the fact that the projected costs of the Olympics at this moment are $13 billion. That it's not going to be anywhere near as high as the Sochi Olympics in 2014, but it's hard to figure out a place where the Olympic costs would be that overblown to the tune of $50+ billion. His reporting also noted the environmental cost, that in the conservation area of Mount Garawang, and I apologize if I got that pronunciation incorrect, 58,000 trees were cut down, including trees that were part of an ancient forest. Okay, cutting down trees in an ancient forest is bad enough, but then cutting down certain tree types that only exist in the Korean peninsula, that there is this very rare bio area, this very rare biodiverse area, and they're cutting down trees to put in Olympic stadia for a few weeks of events. That they're cutting down ancient forests to put up stadia. They're cutting down ancient trees to put up temporary stadia. Capitalism, ladies and gentlemen, capitalism. But all is not entirely lost there. The resistance movement is continuing. The resistance movement is building. People who are involved in the Olympics resistance movement have been mobilizing, have been discussing these stories and pushing back on the policy ideas, the policy movements, as Pyeongchang is set to host the Olympics, and we will certainly be keeping an eye out on what happens with the Olympics being hosted in Pyeongchang. We'll certainly be keeping an eye out there as to what is going on and the stories that continue to come out of there, whether it's over the corruption scandal involving the president, the corruption of the bid team, the environmental issues, the fiscal financial problems, but we will certainly be keeping our eye on what is happening in the world of the Olympics. But it wouldn't be Not Another Sports Show if we didn't try to close out this broadcast with a happy sports story. And we do have a happy sports story to close out this week's Super Show with you. The Olympics is again back in the news, and you're probably thinking, based on the last story, how are you going to say something involving the Olympics is happy? Well, the resistance movement to hosting the games has worked. In St. Moritz and Davos, they have rejected the 2026 Olympics coming to them. They have pulled their name from the bid process and rejected hosting the Olympics, with 60.1% of the voting public there saying no. 60% of the people in St. Moritz and Davos in Switzerland have said no to hosting the games, no to the use of billions of dollars going to the International Olympic Committee, no to the environmental degradation, no to the corruption, no to the mass importation of these corporate sponsors, no to the IOC filling up its helicopters with gold and then flying off into the midst for the next host city, and no to white elephant stadiums that are going to be sitting there in Switzerland doing nothing for the foreseeable future except be a drain on the public finances. No to the housing issues that could cause mass evictions. No to the housing problems. And they certainly said a resounding yes to using their funds in a sane, rational fashion that does not go forward and enrich already wealthy billionaires and their sponsor corporations, to give those corporations and those sponsors and the IOC the ability to run roughshod over their communities, the ability to run roughshod over their nation, and the ability to run roughshod over their finances. This has been Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports, left sports media. We are a weekly news hour highlighting the various intersections overlapping the world of sports, activism, and radical politics. We are available for broadcast by Pacific Radio member network stations, college radio stations, community radio stations, and low-power FM stations, as many already are, and we thank those host stations. If you can't listen live or you happen to miss any of today's broadcast, we are available via audio podcast on iTunes, on Stitcher, and through the Google Play Store. Audio streams of our podcast are available at notanothersportshow.podbean.com, and video editions are available on YouTube thanks to our friends at Urbana Public Television at tinyurl.com/NAS Radio Video. If you'd like to contact the show with your feedback, your thoughts, we would like to definitely send out and hear from you. At Twitter and Instagram, it is at NAS Radio Sports, at Not Another Sports Show on Facebook, NASRadicalSports.com, and the hashtag of NAS Radio to reach out to us. For all of us here at the broadcast, this has been an absolutely stacked week. Pushback in the sports world against anti-trans laws. We've seen pushback against the immigration ban. We have seen the Olympics resistance. We've seen pushback to the Israeli occupation. And you can think that sports and politics are not connected. You can certainly think that people need to stick to sports. But that only means that you're avoiding the real intricacies and interconnections between the sports world and the political world, because they are connected on many different levels. They are connected throughout, from stadium funding to leagues putting Super Bowls in certain locations based on policies that they've got, to athletes using their platforms to speak out, to countries trying to use athletes in pushing a national agenda, to wage and labor issues happening, like we talked about with the D League this week, the soon-to-be G League for Gatorade. That sports and politics are inherently interconnected. They're inherently a part of one another. And Chris Long had a very prescient point here, that it's far past time for the left, the radical movements, the progressive movements to embrace the sports world again and realize that there are these interconnections, that there are these audiences to be made and discuss these sorts of issues with. And that is what Not Another Sports Show is here to do. And so we will be back with you next week to talk about the world of sports and politics.